Hey lovely friends, it's Alora, and today I am here with my first recent reads video of 2020. So what I decided to do, since it's April and I'm a little late to the wrap-up game, is to just go through all of the books that I've read so far in 2020, 10 books at a time. So at this point, it's April 1st, I've read around 25, 26 books so far, I can't recall. And so I'm going to film 2 of these recent reads and then pretty soon I'll film a 3rd one. The very first book that I completed in 2020 was Love in Other Words by Christina Lauren, who are a very famous romance author duo. Now, I typically don't read adult romance books. I like fantasy that has romance in it, and I like contemporary stories that have romance in them, but it's not usually a genre that I gravitate towards. But for the heck of it, I decided to read this one. I actually listened to it on audiobook, and it's the story of this girl who fell deeply in love with her neighbor when she was growing up, when she was in high school. Essentially, some really bad things happened at the end of high school. Their relationship was ruined. She hasn't spoken to him in about 10 years, and she's engaged to this other man when suddenly Elliot, the boy from her childhood, shows up in her life and she realizes that she's still in love with him. I actually really liked this book. This book focused a lot on reading, and we are all readers here, so it added that like extra element of familiarity, but also I just thought the character development was really well done. I was impressed. I was surprised by how impressed I was. So I ended up giving this book a 4 out of 5 stars. I felt like the authors delivered information about the past in the right amounts at the right time so that you didn't know the full story at the beginning, but you didn't feel annoyed that you didn't know the full story. You just wanted to keep reading to find out what had happened that drove these two apart and why our main character was so angry and why she was so sad and why she had really been numbing out to her life for the past decade, and how her relationship with this boy and now man really made her better, and helped her live a fuller life. So I really liked it. It was well done. The second book that I read this year was called This Is How You Lose the Time War, which was written by Amal El-Notar and Max Gladstone. So again, it was another author duo. I'm not quite sure which of the authors wrote which parts, because there are 2 distinct characters in this book that we see the perspectives of. So I'm not sure if one of the authors wrote one perspective and another wrote the other. That would be interesting to find out. I don't really trust myself to be able to accurately describe this book. It's a novella that is sci-fi. I'm, again, typically not a sci-fi reader, so I really started off the year in an odd way for me. But this is a novella that follows these 2 characters who are agents on opposite sides of this time war. In the story, time is represented like a braid. You can move up and down it, you can move through it, you can alter things. And these 2 realities are essentially trying to win the time war and become the one sole reality. So you have on the one hand the garden, which is very, natural and earthy, and on the other hand you have the agency, which is really much more like AI and computerization and that sort of thing. So you have this dichotomy between these 2 time threads that really want to be the only one. And you have these 2 agents from opposite sides who start to form this little rivalry, and the rivalry turns into a playful rivalry as they begin to leave messages for each other throughout this braid of time that they find at different times throughout their lives as they're going about trying to win the time war. And it's the story really of these 2 women who are falling in love, and they've never met, but they are supposed to be opposing each other, and they're the best that the agency and the garden have, but here they are starting to really endear themselves to one another and just leaving these snarky and then increasingly sweet messages and trying to find each other, trying to be in the same place at the same time, even though they're really not allowed to be, they're not supposed to be, they're supposed to be these mortal enemies. So it's a little bit of a star-crossed lovers situation. But this book was just so fascinating. The way in which it was written was incredibly unique. I'd never read a book that was written quite like this, and it threw me off at first, but then I decided that I actually really loved it, and I became invested in these characters and their love story, and I just wanted them to be together, and I was so fascinated by the way in which time, the threads of time, the strands of time, and the braid was kind of described. It was a really unique concept that I quite liked. Even though I'm not usually a fan of time travel books, I really liked this. I actually really loved it. I gave it 5 stars. So that was the second book that I read. This is just the dust jacket. I lent it to my dad. The third book that I read was a poetry collection by Emily Berry titled Dear Boy. This was recommended by Ariel Bissett, which is the reason that I picked it up, and I didn't really like it. I gave it a 3 stars. It was okay. There were a couple of poems in here that I really liked. One was called Dear Husband, which I definitely recommend. You can actually look it up and read it online without buying the poetry collection, and even though of course I agree with and promote supporting artists and writers and booksellers, you know, you might want to look it up online and just see if her poetry is something that you're interested in. I really liked Dear Husband. There were a couple of poems in here and definitely some lines. I just flipped it open to a random page. It says, "Will you pick wildflowers to garland my wilder hair?" I don't know, there were just some interesting lines. All elbows being unfamiliar, even one's own. I like that. Like, she has an interesting way of writing, but a lot of this book was discussing, I don't know, concepts that were a little bit deviant, and I wasn't expecting that. It wasn't at all what I was going into this anticipating. So for that reason, I guess I just didn't really like it. You know perfectly well, I believe, nothing worthwhile is explainable. I mean, there are good lines. There are good lines, but overall I didn't love the collection. I always have a hard time rating poetry collections because, you know, it's inevitable that there will be some you like and some that you don't like, or at least some that you like more than others. Book number 4 was Great Goddesses, Life Lessons from Myths and Monsters by Nikita Gill. This is a collection about mythology and about goddesses in mythology. At first, I didn't really love it as I was reading through it, but by the second half it starts to become more of a story and less of these separate little tiny poems about different goddesses, and I just really liked it. It started to really grow on me, and I started to see the connections between them, and her writing is really neat. Her writing is definitely reminiscent of fairy tales and fables, plus the cover is really pretty. Wow, it's bright, but it's shiny and gorgeous, and I love anything to do with mythology, so I ended up giving this one a 4 out of 5 stars. One other thing to mention is that there are illustrations throughout, which is always super fun. Like here we have a nice Artemis print there. Oh my god, the next book is my favorite book of the entire year so far. I'm so excited to talk about it, and that is The Starless C by Erin Morgenstern. I am a diehard fan of The Night Circus. I've read it multiple times. I think her way of describing things, her imagery is so lovely, and it's like, it's delectable. It's like you could just eat it up and your imagination runs wild with everything that she describes, and she did that same thing. She pulled off that same magic trick with this book. The imagery in this book is absolutely stunning. This is the story of Zachary Ezra Rollins, who one day is leafing through some books in his university library, and he comes across this book with no identifying features, and this book is really interesting. It has a bunch of interesting stories in it, and about midway through the book he comes across a story that actually happened to him in real life. Like, it's a story about him and about his life when he was young, and this is something that happened to him that nobody else would ever have known about. He never told anyone, and nobody else was involved, so no one should know about this. Additionally, the publication date actually dated back to before he was born. That's kind of the catalyst for his adventure into this underground, gigantic library system. It's like this magical world filled with books. The story has a lot of themes in it, including star-crossed lovers, and it kind of goes back and forth between Zachary's perspective and these other vignettes of stories that really feel like fairy tales from another time, but you know, midway through the book and further along in the book, they start to connect and you start to see how everything is interrelated. This book is intoxicating and enchanting and delightful and whimsical, and the writing is so magical, and you have to read it. Please read this book. I absolutely loved it. Obviously, 5 out of 5 stars, 10 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read was a graphic novel called Princess Ever After by Katie O'Neill. Now, Katie O'Neill is the author of the Tea Dragon Society, which is something that I adore, and I have since read all of her other books. And this one is a story about, obviously, 2 princesses, one of them who's kind of this badass adventurer, and the other who is this nurturing, soft other princess, who begin to fall in love. The story was cute, the illustrations were cute. I felt like it was really short, and I just didn't feel like I got enough out of it. So I liked the idea, but I feel like it could have been developed further. And I believe this is one of her first, if not her first books. So it feels a little less polished than her later works, but it was still worth the read. It had a nice female-female romance, and that was lovely, but otherwise not my absolute favorite. The next book that I read was another audiobook, and it was actually another romance audiobook, and that was One True Loves by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Now, the internet and booktube has blown up with Taylor Jenkins Reid for Evelyn Hugo and for Daisy Jones, both of which I've read, both of which I liked but didn't love. I thought that Daisy Jones, this is a common opinion, but Daisy Jones was really good on audiobook because of the full cast. And so anyway, I decided that I wanted to try one of her backlist books, and the one that I chose was One True Loves. It's essentially the story of this woman who was in love with this boy since she was in mid-high school, and they ended up getting married and going on adventures together. But a little bit after they get married, he essentially goes on this adventure up to Alaska. Hey! And he gets lost, and everyone is sure that he's died. And so after several years, she has to move on, and she's just filled with grief because she loved this man. She really, really did. She loved who she was when she was with him, and she loved the adventures they went on together. She loved their life together. But she has to kind of confront this reality that he is no longer alive and no longer part of her life. And so after a few years, she ends up meeting this other boy from her childhood who had had a crush on her the whole time, and they end up falling in love. And their love is a simpler, quieter kind of love than the love she shared with her first husband, but it's just as deep. And they end up getting engaged, and they have this whole new life. She feels like a completely different person. She has taken over her family's bookstore, stopped going on crazy adventures. She's become a cat lady, she's cut her hair, she's taken up an instrument. You know, everything about her life has changed, and she feels like she has fundamentally changed as a person. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, after 3 or 4 years, her allegedly dead husband shows up, and he's been like living on this tiny little island, barely surviving, losing his teeth, you know, growing a big beard, losing lots of weight, trying desperately to survive, not having anybody find him because he was like in the middle of nowhere in the ocean on this tiny little rock island. And finally he made his way back, and here he arrives, and his wife has all of a sudden gotten engaged to somebody else. So it's sort of a love triangle, which I don't typically like, but it's not really a love triangle because she wasn't in love with the two people at the same time, like trying to decide between them. Now it really becomes a story of her trying to decide between the multiple versions of herself. Who does she want to be? Does she want to be the person she was when she was with her original husband, who was this travel writer, this adventurer, this person who was spontaneous and never sat down and never stayed in the same place? Or does she want to be the kind of person who runs her family bookstore and who has pets and who really stays in the same place and has this like quieter, more content life? And so I really liked that about the book. I thought it was an interesting question to ponder. Ultimately, I didn't love the delivery of the book, so I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars. For me, Taylor Jenkins Reid just doesn't quite hit home. There's something about her books that I just don't quite vibe with, but it was an interesting story, like I said. Very, very fascinating to contemplate. Alright, the 8th book that I read this year was another graphic novel, and it was called Bloom by Kevin Panchetta and Savannah Ganichow. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. This is a book that's kind of like Heartstoppers by Alice Oseman. It's a male-male romance about these two boys, one of whom really wants to become a musician, but his family owns a bakery, and his family needs him in the bakery. They really want him there, they want him helping out, they want him to eventually take over the shop, and he doesn't want anything to do with bread, and he wants to get as far away from this little town as possible. And then there's this other boy who arrives in this small town because his aunt has died, so he's in charge of coming to her house and kind of taking care of her belongings and sorting through her things and selling the house and things like that. And so he ends up getting a job over the summer at the bakery, and romance ensues. I really liked the color scheme. It's all blue and black scale. It's really nice. But I never really connected with the characters. I didn't feel that like, oh, heartwarming, melty feeling that I like to feel with romance books. So I ended up giving this one a 3 out of 5 stars too, but if you like Heartstoppers and want another story that's very similar, I would go ahead and check this one out. The next book that I read was also an audiobook, and it was called Heavy, an American Memoir by Kiese Lehman. And the audiobook was narrated by the author, which is a feature that I absolutely love. I think that that's the way that all audiobooks should be, at least memoirs or any kind of nonfiction audiobooks. Plus he had a really cool, smooth voice, so it was very enjoyable to listen to him. This is a book about what it means to be Black in Southern America. It's a book about academic institutions and how they handle race. It's a book about weight and how that is influenced by race and how race impacts many aspects of life. It's so difficult for me to place a value judgment on somebody's life experiences. So I have a hard time rating, memoirs on a star scale, but I didn't really enjoy this book. I thought that it came across to me as kind of angry. And that's not to say that this man doesn't deserve to be those things and that he's not allowed to be those things, and if that's the way he feels, that's the way he feels, and that's perfectly valid, and that's his life experience. So I can't really, it's not fair for me to place my value judgment on that. But from a perspective of someone trying to understand someone else who has lived a very different life from oneself, it's never easy when the other person is angry. I don't know if that quite makes sense, but if I'm trying to put myself in your shoes but you're acting like you're mad at me, I'm going to be less likely to want to put myself in your shoes and see the world from your perspective. So I didn't like that because I have a very privileged, middle-class white perspective. And I admit that, I know that. I understand that that is privileged in our country and in the world. And yet I still don't like being made to feel bad about it. It made me less able to empathize with him. So that's all I have to say about that. But I do think, so I guess that's not all I have to say about that. I do think that it was a very potent and provocative and thought-provoking memoir, and I definitely would recommend it. I just didn't like it. Whew, we're to the last of the first 10 books that I read in 2020, and that is Long Live the Tribe of Fatherless Girls by T. Kira Madden. First of all, look at the beauty that is this cover. It's sparkly, it has like little sparkles and glitter all over it. I love it. I love the ombre. I know that's, a very design-oriented element, but I love design, so it's important to me. Speaking of privilege, this is a memoir about a girl who grew up with a lot of financial privilege. Her family was very wealthy, and yet she was neglected because both of her parents abused drugs. So it's her story of growing up in a drug-abusing household. It's also her story of growing up and trying to figure out her sexuality. It also morphs into more of a family-oriented story of her realizing that she has another sibling out there, and I loved that part of the book that was towards the end. This is told in kind of an essay format where you could read each one individually. They're all like little anecdotes and contemplations on different periods of her life and different things that happened to her and that she did. But towards the later half of the book, she starts to get closer to her actual age now, and some really interesting developments start to happen. So I thought this was really interesting. T. Kira Madden is biracial. Her father was white and her mother was Chinese Hawaiian, I believe. I don't want to be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure. So she also talked about how that influenced her life. I actually really enjoyed the writing style in this. Some of the stories were heartbreaking or gross or upsetting, and there are definitely a lot of trigger warnings that I'm not going to list, but you can go ahead and look them up if you're interested in reading this book. Anyhow, I really appreciated the way in which she wrote this, and I thought that it was really well done, so I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars. So doing a little math, that means that my average rating on a 5-star scale for the first 10 books that I read this year was 3.7, which I feel like is a little bit lower than normal for me because in the past I have been known to be overly generous with my 5-star reads and even my 4-star. And this year I decided that I want to be a little bit more judicious with giving those out because I want 5-star reads to reflect books that I absolutely loved, like the Starless C or like This Is How You Lose the Time War. So I did have a really pretty good first 10 books of the year. As you'll see in my next video, my second 10 books of the year were not so great. Some of them were great. There were definitely a few in there that I didn't connect with, and I'm looking forward to filming that video for you very soon. But thank you for sticking around. Thank you for watching this video. Let me know your favorite book that you've read this year so far in the description, in the comment section down below. I hope that you're staying safe, staying inside if you can, and I'm sending you lots and lots of love for this very challenging beginning of the decade. But I am a firm believer in trying as much as possible to focus on the good and focus on things that we can be grateful for even in difficult times. So I hope that you're able to find some solace in books, and until next time, I'm sending you love.